She was 23 years old, and the world had already written her off. They gave her until the first hard frost to fail, to vanish from the land she had just bought with the last of her father's savings. But what nobody in the Dakota Territory of 1887 understood was that she carried a knowledge that could not be stripped away, a memory of a voice that would keep her alive when the world went white. The system she built beneath her floorboards would change everything. Stay close, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. From the county road that ran south toward Redemption, the cabin was little more than a smudge against the enormous, indifferent sky of the Dakota Prairie. It was late September, 1887. The cottonwoods along the creek bed had already surrendered their leaves, leaving behind a filigree of gray branches against a pale, washed-out blue. The wind, which had not stopped for a month, carried the smell of dust and the coming cold. To a traveler passing in a wagon, the place looked abandoned, a testament to some prior failure. The roof of the small cabin sagged in the middle, the stone chimney had a lean to it, and the single window was a dark, vacant eye. But the property was not abandoned. A thin tendril of smoke, almost invisible, rose from the chimney and was immediately torn to shreds by the wind. And if one looked closer, past the leaning shed and the broken fence line, one could see a figure working. Ruth Alden moved with a steady, unhurried rhythm that was at odds with the frantic energy of the landscape. She was splitting wood, not with the desperate haste of someone surprised by the season, but with the methodical economy of a person who has made a calculation and is now simply executing the result. Each swing of the axe was precise, each log split cleanly and stacked in a growing wall against the north side of the cabin. She had arrived in Redemption 2 months prior, a solitary young woman with a quiet demeanor and a small, heavy satchel containing the deed to this forgotten acre and the last of the money from her father's death. The land was marginal, the cabin decrepit, but it was hers. It was the only thing in the world that was. That ownership, however, was conditional. On the 1st of October, Mr. Silas Croft, the man who owned the town's bank, its general store, and the mortgage on nearly every homestead for 50 miles, had paid her a visit. He had not dismounted from his horse, a fine black gelding that shifted impatiently beneath him. He had looked down at her, at the work she had done clearing the yard, and a small, unreadable smile had touched his lips. The papers were on the table inside, the ones she had signed at the county seat. He was merely reminding her of the terms. A balloon payment was due on the 1st of May, a sum she could not possibly earn through a Dakota winter. "It is a formality, Miss Alden," he said, his voice smooth and without malice. "A way for the bank to secure its interest. Most find it more prudent to sell back before the snows, to avoid the hardship." He was offering her a pittance, a fraction of what she had paid. He was describing her life to her as a foregone conclusion, a brief and unfortunate anecdote. She had listened, her hands still, her gaze level. She said nothing. He took her silence for agreement, or perhaps for the dumb incomprehension of a woman alone. "I will have the papers drawn up," he continued. "You can sign them at the store when you come for your winter supplies." He was telling her that her only source of provision was also the instrument of her dispossession. He was certain of the outcome. He tipped his hat and rode away, the dust swirling in his wake. Ruth stood for a long time watching the road. Then she went back inside, not to pack, but to look at the worn floorboards of her cabin. She had not moved on. She had no intention of moving on. The world had presented her with a description of her life, and she was refusing to accept it. The town of Redemption settled into a quiet, collective agreement about the woman in the old Miller cabin. The consensus, formed in whispers over the counter at Croft's General Store and in the pews of the Lutheran Church, was that she was a tragic figure, destined for failure. Her refusal of Mr. Croft's generous offer was seen not as strength, but as a kind of foolish, youthful pride, that the coming winter would surely correct. The community's response was not one of overt hostility, but of a more passive and chilling abandonment. When Ruth went into town for salt and lamp oil, the conversations would halt. Mrs. Croft, who ran the store while her husband ran the bank, would measure out her goods with a cool efficiency, never meeting her eye. Credit, which was the lifeblood of every other homesteader until the spring thaw, was not extended. Cash only for this account, Silas Croft had instructed, a quiet, deniable measure that was as effective as a locked door. Neighbors who had initially been curious, even friendly, now seemed to find their boots intensely interesting when she passed. They were not unkind people, but they were practical. They understood the structure of their world, and in that structure, Silas Croft was the load-bearing wall. To align oneself with Ruth Alden was to stand on the wrong side of a power she could not hope to overcome. They were certain she would be gone by the first hard frost, driven out by loneliness and the sheer impossibility of her situation. Meanwhile, the prairie itself was issuing its own warnings. The geese had flown south weeks earlier than the almanac predicted. The muskrats were building their lodges thick and high along the creek. Old Man Hemlock, who had trapped this territory for 40 years, spat tobacco juice into the dust and declared he hadn't seen a sky this color since the winter of '48, a winter that had left wolves bold enough to raid barns in broad daylight. The signs were there for anyone to read, and the town read them with a growing sense of unease, laying in extra cords of wood, banking their foundations with sod, and speaking of the coming cold in low, worried tones. They saw Ruth's small, isolated cabin as a tomb in waiting. But inside that cabin, Ruth was engaged in a different kind of reading. She was not looking at the sky, but at the small ledger her father had taught her to keep. On one side, she listed her assets: 1 milk cow, a small flock of chickens, the meager garden's yield of potatoes and squash in the root cellar, and the tools her father had left her. On the other side, she calculated the deficits: the calories required to survive a 6-month winter, the BTUs of heat needed to keep from freezing, the vast and terrifying gap between what she had and what she would need. The town saw a woman with nothing. They could not see the calculations she was making, the plan that was forming in the quiet space behind her eyes. They could not see the seed of her hidden advantage. It began with a simple decision. If she could not buy from the town, she would bypass it. She took her axe and her strength, the only currency she had that Croft did not control, and went to the neighboring farms. She traded a day's labor splitting wood for a bushel of wheat. She spent 2 days mending a fence for a sack of corn. She worked from sunup to sundown, not for coin, but for grain, the one thing that could be stored, the one thing that held the pure, unnegotiable energy of life. The source of the knowledge was her father, a man whose life had been a long, quiet war against entropy. He had not been a farmer or a frontiersman. He had been a quartermaster on the great iron ore ships of the lakes, a man who lived by the ledger and the manifest. His world was one of sealed holds, of provisions for long voyages, of calculating the precise point where a crew would run out of food between Duluth and Buffalo. He had a profound, almost religious respect for the physical laws of the world, for the patient, methodical ways that heat and cold, moisture and dryness could destroy a man's careful plans. He had taught Ruth not through formal lessons, but through conversation. In the quiet evenings in their small house in Cleveland, the smell of coal smoke and damp wool in the air. He would sit at the kitchen table, sharpening a tool or mending a piece of canvas, and he would talk. He spoke of spoilage as if it were a thinking enemy. "It's the water, Ruthie," he'd say, holding a dried apple to the light. "And the air. They work together. You can have 1,000 pounds of flour, but if it's got 10% moisture and a bit of warmth, you've got 1,000 pounds of mold. You're not storing food, you're storing time, and time is a thief." He taught her about the subtle science of preservation. He explained how to render tallow to seal the lids of barrels, how pitch could make wood impervious to water, how a tightly packed space with no air was a fortress against decay. He had a particular obsession with temperature. He saw it as the great regulator, the master variable. One evening, after a fierce blizzard had buried their street in snow, he had taken her down to the shallow dirt cellar. He lit a lantern and pointed to the earthen wall. "Feel that," he said. She pressed her small hand against the packed dirt. It was cool, but not cold. It felt still. "The air outside is 10 below zero," he said. "The snow is 5 feet deep, but 4 feet down, the earth doesn't know it's winter. It remembers the summer. It holds a steady temperature, 40 degrees, give or take. It's a cellar you don't have to build. It's a gift." That was the precise principle that would save her life. The earth itself was a battery, storing the warmth of the sun. He explained that the frost line was a barrier. Above it, the world was chaos, swinging from bake-oven summer to crystalline winter. Below it, the world was stable, predictable, safe. He told her stories of sailors who had buried caches of supplies on deserted islands, knowing they could come back years later and find them safe, protected by the cool, unwavering dark of the ground. She had stored these conversations away as a girl, the way a child collects interesting stones. They were curiosities, fragments of her father's strange and serious world. She did not know she was assembling a manual for her own survival. She had believed him because he was her father, and his words carried the weight of certainty. But belief and knowledge were not the same thing. Belief was trusting the map. Knowledge was arriving at the destination. As she stood on the dirt floor of her Dakota cabin, the wind howling outside, his voice came back to her not as a memory, but as an instruction. The knowledge was there, complete and waiting. All that remained was the labor. The labor began on the 1st of October, the day after Silas Croft's visit. She did not start with the grain. She started with the house itself, a vessel that had to be made worthy of its cargo. She spent a week chinking the logs of the cabin, mixing clay from the creek bank with dried grass to create a thick, insulating mortar that she pressed into every crack and seam. She worked until her fingers were raw and caked with mud, sealing the small airways through which the winter would try to enter. She cut sod from the prairie in thick, heavy bricks and stacked them against the north and west walls of the cabin, creating an earthen embankment that rose 3 feet high, a shield against the prevailing winds. It was back-breaking work, each brick of sod weighing 50 pounds, the process slow and grueling. She worked by the light, rising before the sun and stopping only when the evening gloom made it impossible to see. Her hands, accustomed to the smooth handle of an axe, blistered and then hardened. Muscles she did not know she possessed ached with a deep, resonant pain. She ate sparingly, hoarding her small supply of potatoes and smoked meat, her body fueled by a cold, clear purpose. While the town saw a woman engaged in a futile struggle against the inevitable, she was engaged in a dialogue with physics. Next, she turned her attention to the floor. She pried up the rough-hewn floorboards in the center of the single room, exposing the dark, packed earth beneath. The cabin had no cellar, only a shallow crawl space filled with dust and the debris of forgotten years. Here, she began to dig. She used a small spade and her own hands, scooping the dry soil into a bucket and carrying it outside. She dug with a fierce, methodical intensity, moving past the loose topsoil into the dense, compacted clay below. Her goal was a depth of 5 feet, a foot below the deepest recorded frost line in that part of the territory. The hole was a perfect rectangle, 10 feet long by 4 feet wide, a grave for her wealth. She lined the bottom and sides with flat river stones she carried one by one from the creek, creating a clean, stable chamber. While the digging progressed, she prepared the vessels. She had traded her labor for 6 large pickle barrels from the Larson farm. They smelled sourly of brine, but they were sturdy oak, their staves tight. She spent 3 days scorching their insides with burning coals to sterilize them, then scrubbing them with sand and water until they were clean. The most critical step was the sealing. From her father's trunk, she retrieved a small, heavy pot and a block of beeswax. She rendered the last of her salted pork to get a bucket of pure white lard. Following the memory of his instruction, she melted the beeswax and the lard together, creating a thick, waxy sealant. She collected the sacks of grain she had earned: wheat, oats, corn, and a small sack of precious barley. The total weight was just over 200 pounds. One by one, she filled the barrels, leaving 2 inches of space at the top. She placed the heavy wooden lids on, and then, with a small brush, she painted the hot wax mixture over every seam, every crack, every pore in the wood, layer after layer, until each barrel was encased in a waterproof, airtight cocoon. It took another full day to lower the heavy barrels into the stone-lined pit. She used ropes and a simple lever made from a fence post, her body straining with the effort. When they were all nestled at the bottom, she covered them with a layer of clean, dry straw and then carefully replaced the earth, packing it down firmly. Finally, she relaid the floorboards. When she was finished, the room looked exactly as it had before. There was no sign of the treasure beneath, no evidence of the weeks of secret, frantic labor. There was only a clean floor, a stacked woodpile, and a young woman waiting for the cold. The first test came not with a blizzard, but with a quiet, lethal descent of cold. It arrived in the second week of November, a high-pressure system from the Canadian north that scrubbed the sky to a brilliant, unforgiving blue and drained all the heat from the land. The temperature dropped steadily for 3 days. The creek froze solid. The air grew so cold it felt sharp in the lungs, each breath a small pain. In town, the mercury in the thermometer outside Croft's store sank to 10 degrees below zero, then 15. It was the kind of dry, still cold that found every crack, every weakness in a man's preparations. It was a cold that probed and questioned. Inside her cabin, Ruth felt it as a constant, pressing siege. Despite the sod banking and the chinked logs, the interior temperature hovered just above freezing. The single small window was coated in a thick, opaque layer of frost. Her breath plumed in the air. The milk cow, brought inside to share the small space and its vital body heat, shifted restlessly, its own breath steaming. Ruth kept the small cast-iron stove burning at a minimal level, feeding it just enough wood to keep a bed of coals alive. She was rationing fuel as carefully as she was rationing food, calculating the burn rate against her remaining woodpile. The cabin was not a space of comfort. It was a machine for survival, and it was performing at the very edge of its tolerance. That first night, as the temperature outside fell to a windless -20, she lay under a pile of every blanket and quilt she owned, listening to the cabin timbers groan in the cold. Doubt, which had been kept at bay by the rhythm of hard labor, began to creep in. She had followed her father's instructions, trusted his principles. She had believed in the stable warmth of the earth. But belief was an abstraction. The cold was real, a physical presence in the room. She had staked her life on a memory, on a conversation from her childhood. It was possible her father had been wrong. It was possible she had misremembered. It was possible the Dakota prairie did not obey the same rules as the Ohio soil of her youth. Sometime after midnight, unable to bear the uncertainty, she rose from her cot. The floorboards were icy beneath her bare feet, shivering in the profound cold of the room. She took a pry bar and carefully lifted the single designated floorboard she had left unsecured. A puff of air rose from the opening, air that was not cold. It was cool, but it did not have the sharp, crystalline bite of the air in the cabin. It smelled of damp earth, stone, and faintly of straw. She had tied a small dairy thermometer to a length of twine. Holding a lantern, she lowered it slowly into the dark pit until she felt it rest on the straw covering the barrels. She waited, counting to 100, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Then, carefully, she drew it back up. She held the thermometer to the lantern light, her hand trembling slightly. The mercury was a solid, unwavering line. It read 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the world was 20 degrees below zero. In her cabin, it was 35. But in the pit, in the silent, protected dark, it was 41. The grain was safe. The principle was not a memory or a belief. It was a physical fact. A wave of relief so profound, it felt like exhaustion washed over her. She sat on the cold floor, the lantern light flickering on her face, and for the first time in months, she thought of her father not with the grief of loss, but with a sudden, overwhelming clarity. She understood now that his obsession with logistics and preservation was not about paranoia. It was a form of love. It was his way of trying to build a fortress against the cruel randomness of the world. He had given her the only inheritance that mattered, the one thing that could not be taken from her. Survival was no longer in doubt, only its difficulty remained. The snows began in early December and did not stop. They fell with a soft, relentless persistence that buried the prairie in a uniform blanket of white, smoothing the contours of the land until the horizon itself seemed to disappear. The county road vanished. Fences became faint lines sketched on a vast, empty page. The world shrank to the dimensions of what one could see from a frosted window. By mid-December, a visitor arrived, the first since the snows had closed in. It was Reverend Michael, the town's Lutheran minister, making his rounds on a sturdy sleigh pulled by a draft horse. He was a kind man, his face etched with a genuine, if pitying, concern. He brought a small loaf of bread from his wife and a copy of a month-old newspaper. He expected to find Ruth huddled and desperate, perhaps already suffering from frostbite or malnutrition. Instead, he found a cabin that was cold, yes, but immaculately clean and orderly. He saw the healthy sheen on the milk cow's coat, the small, disciplined stack of firewood by the stove, the quiet resolve in Ruth's eyes. He could not reconcile the evidence of his senses with the story the town had agreed upon. He saw no visible stockpile of food beyond a few potatoes in a bin. He could not read what he was seeing. The grammar of her survival was alien to him. "The Lord provides, Miss Alden," he said, his voice laced with an uncertainty he could not hide. "I am managing fine, Reverend," she replied, her own voice calm and level. He left confused, the loaf of bread sitting untouched on her table. His report to the town only deepened the mystery. She was alive, he said, and seemed well, but he could not say how. The word spread, shifting the town's narrative from impending tragedy to unsettling puzzle. A week before Christmas, a second visitor appeared, a dark shape materializing out of the blowing snow. It was Silas Croft. He did not come in a sleigh, but on the same black gelding, an act of sheer will against the elements. He had come expecting to find her broken, ready to sign his papers for a pittance and a ride back to whatever charity awaited her in redemption. He found the same scene that had confounded the minister: order, discipline, and an unnerving sense of permanence. Croft's eyes, unlike the minister's, were not looking for signs of faith, but for signs of weakness. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the empty shelves, the small woodpile. He was an accountant of suffering, and the numbers were not adding up. He saw no fear in her. He saw no desperation. He saw only a quiet, infuriating endurance. "The offer still stands, Miss Alden," he said, his voice flat and hard. "A warm room at the boarding house. A ticket east when the train can get through." "I am not leaving," she said. It was not a plea or a defiance, but a simple statement of fact. A flicker of something cold and sharp moved in his eyes. He had come to finalize a transaction he believed was already complete. Her survival was an anomaly, an error in his ledger that he could not abide. He looked around the Spartan room one last time, at the frost-caked window, at the thin plume of steam from the cow's nostrils. He was a man who believed the world ran on principles he understood. Leverage, debt, necessity. Her survival violated those principles. As he turned to leave, he paused in the doorway, the wind-driven snow swirling around him. He looked back at her, a solitary figure in the dim light of the cabin. "The rail line is blocked at Fargo," he said, the words dropping like stones into the cold air. "No supplies will be getting through before spring. Not for anyone." It was not information. It was a verdict. He was telling her that whatever small hoard she might have, it would not be enough. The entire territory was now a closed system, and he was confident that his own stores would outlast hers. He pulled his collar up and added with a quiet cruelty that was more chilling than any shout, "Let the winter have you." He closed the door, leaving her alone with the sound of the wind and the plain demonstration of his intent. He would not have to force her out. He would simply wait for the cold to do his work for him. The great blizzard, the one that would be spoken of for generations, arrived on the 12th of January, 1888. It did not come with warning. The morning had been unusually mild, a breather, the old-timers called it. Children were at school, men were out checking their livestock, and the world felt deceptively calm. Then, in the early afternoon, the sky turned a sickening yellow-gray, and the temperature dropped 30 degrees in an hour. A wall of white, fine as flour and driven by a 70-mile-per-hour wind, slammed into the prairie. The world outside the window simply ceased to exist. For the next 3 days, the territory was held in a state of suspended animation, buried under a storm of unimaginable ferocity. In the town of Redemption, the human cost began to mount, rendered not in a single dramatic event, but in a series of small, fatal mistakes. The Hansen family, whose cabin was a mile north of town, ran out of firewood on the second day. Mr. Hansen, a strong and capable man, believed he could make it to his woodpile, not 50 yards from his door. He tied a rope to the doorknob and walked out into the white maelstrom. His wife found him the next morning, frozen solid 10 feet from the house, his hand still outstretched toward a cord of wood he could not see. The community's carefully laid preparations began to fail. The roof of the livery stable, not built to withstand the sheer weight of the snow, collapsed, killing 3 horses. The Jensens, who had banked their foundation with hay instead of sod, discovered too late that the wind could tear through it, and spent 2 days huddled with their children in a single room, burning their furniture to keep from freezing. Silas Croft's general store, the supposed fortress of the town's supplies, became a symbol of the growing panic. The rail line being blocked was no longer a rumor. It was a hard and terrifying fact. Croft, who had always operated on the principle of just-in-time inventory, watched his stockpile dwindle at an alarming rate. He began rationing, first sugar and coffee, then flour and salt. The prices tripled overnight. The smooth veneer of community frayed, replaced by suspicion and a grim, individual accounting. Meanwhile, in the small cabin on the edge of the prairie, Ruth Alden's system performed exactly as designed. The storm raged, the wind screamed, the snow piled up until it covered the single window completely, plunging the room into a perpetual twilight. But inside, life continued its steady, disciplined rhythm. The sod banking and the deep snow acted as a perfect insulator, holding the cabin's meager heat. The internal temperature remained stable, just above freezing. Each morning, Ruth would pry up the floorboard, her silent companion in the cold, and retrieve a measure of grain from one of the sealed barrels. She had a small hand-cranked grist mill, another of her father's tools, and the sound of it grinding wheat into flour was a steady, reassuring presence in the quiet room. She would cook a small portion of porridge on the stove for herself and the cow, the warmth of it spreading through her body. The contrast was the argument. While the established community, with all its resources and social structures, struggled and failed, the dismissed, isolated woman survived in relative comfort. It was not a matter of luck or divine providence. It was a matter of knowledge applied correctly against resources applied carelessly. On the night the cold reached its absolute extreme, the thermometer outside Croft's store freezing at its lowest mark of -40 degrees, Ruth sat on her cot, listening to the wind. She was not afraid. She was warm enough, she was fed, and she knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the frozen earth, that she would see the spring. The system her father had taught her was not just a clever trick. It was a better way of understanding the world. The first knock on the door came a week after the great blizzard had passed, when the sky had cleared but the world remained a frozen, impassable landscape of immense snowdrifts. The sound was faint, almost lost in the wind, a desperate, muffled tapping. Ruth opened the door to a figure she barely recognized as her neighbor, Thomas Miller. His face was a mask of wind-burned skin and frozen tears, his beard caked with ice. Behind him, huddled together for warmth, were his wife, Sarah, and their 2 small children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, wrapped in every piece of cloth they owned. They had walked a mile through waist-deep snow, their own cabin's food supply completely exhausted. "Please," Thomas Miller managed to say, his voice a raw whisper. "The children, they haven't eaten in 2 days." Ruth did not hesitate. She brought them inside, into the cold but life-sustaining space of her cabin. She sat them down, removed their frozen boots and wraps, and chafed their numb hands and feet. She gave them warm water to drink, then ladled out 4 bowls of the thick, nourishing porridge she had just cooked. They ate with a silent, desperate hunger that spoke more eloquently than any words. The little girl, her face pale and pinched, looked up at Ruth after she had finished her bowl. "Is there more?" she asked, her voice small and timid. "Yes," Ruth said. "There is more." That night, the 5 of them and the cow shared the small cabin. Ruth fed them again from her stores, a supply she knew she could not spare indefinitely if she were merely a charity station. And so, the next morning, she made a decision. She was not just going to feed them, she was going to teach them. She gathered Thomas and Sarah around the loose floorboard. She explained what lay beneath, not as a miracle, but as a system. She told them about her father, about the frost line, about the stable temperature of the deep earth. She showed them the sealed barrels, the dry grain. "This is how you survive," she said, her voice simple and direct. "Not by luck, by knowledge." Thomas Miller, a proud man who had always prided himself on his self-sufficiency, listened with a dawning expression of awe and humility. He had seen her digging in the fall, and like the others, had dismissed it as the strange obsession of a lonely woman. Now he understood. He was not a supplicant receiving a handout. He was a student receiving a lesson. Word of the Miller family's salvation traveled in the mysterious way that news does in a crisis, carried by a desperate hope. A few days later, another family arrived, the Olsons, their faces gaunt with hunger. Ruth took them in as well. She fed them, and then she taught them. She explained the principle. She showed them the barrels. She made them understand that their survival was not in her hands, but in their own ability to grasp the knowledge she was offering. Her small cabin became the quiet center of the community's survival. It was no longer a place of isolation, but a school. She refused to be a mere dispenser of food, because knowledge that saves only its holder is knowledge poorly used. She taught every visitor what she knew, sketching diagrams in the frost on the window pane, explaining the science of moisture and temperature, turning her father's wisdom into a shareable, life-giving currency. The people who came to her left not just with full bellies, but with a new understanding of the world they inhabited. The final visitor of that long winter arrived in late February. The cold had not broken, but a brittle, desperate stillness had settled over the landscape. Silas Croft came alone, on foot. The proud black gelding had died a month ago, a victim of the feed shortage. The man who appeared at Ruth's door was not the confident banker who had dictated the terms of her failure. This was a man diminished, his face hollowed out by fear, his expensive wool coat looking thin and inadequate against the brutal cold. He did not meet her eyes. He stood on her threshold, his gaze fixed on the floor, a man who had come to the end of his own ledger. His arrogance had been stripped away layer by layer, first by the storm, then by the emptying of his store, and finally by the hungry faces of his own wife and children. He, who had controlled the flow of every dollar and every sack of flour in redemption, was now destitute in the only currency that mattered. "My wife, my children," he began, his voice raspy and low. He could not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Ruth looked at him, at the man who had declared that the winter should have her, and she felt not triumph, not anger, but only a quiet, weary recognition of their shared condition. They were all subject to the same physical laws. His money and his power had been an illusion, a story people had agreed to believe. The cold was the truth. She stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. She took a bowl, ladled it full of the same porridge she had given the Millers and the Olsons, and handed it to him. He took it, his hand trembling. Then she went to the stove, took a clean sack, and began to scoop a measure of precious grain into it. Not a handout, but a precise, calculated amount. As she worked, she spoke to him in the same calm, instructional tone she had used with everyone else. "The earth below the frost line holds a steady temperature," she said. "If you seal your stores from air and moisture, the ground will keep them for you." She was not offering forgiveness. She was not demanding an apology. She was offering him the same knowledge she had offered the others. The equality of the treatment was the verdict, delivered without speeches or gloating. He took the sack of grain, his shoulders slumped. He started, then stopped. He could not find the words. He turned and left, a man humbled not by her, but by a reality he had refused to see. When the thaw finally came in April, and the rail line was cleared, the story of Ruth Alden was the first thing that traveled out of redemption. It was told not by her, but by the families she had saved. The Millers, the Olsons, and a dozen others went before the county commissioners and the circuit judge. They gave sworn testimony, not of a crime committed by Croft, but of a life saved by Ruth. They spoke of her foresight, her labor, and most importantly, her willingness to share the knowledge that had kept them all alive. Faced with the unanimous, organic consensus of the community, the legal structures buckled. Silas Croft, a silent and chastened figure at the back of the hearing, offered no opposition when the commission, citing extraordinary contributions to the public welfare, declared Ruth Alden's deed to her land paid in full, her title clear and absolute. Her vindication came not in a dramatic courtroom battle, but in the quiet, unassailable weight of proven competence and shared survival. Time, which had seemed to stand still during the long winter, now began to accelerate. Ruth Alden lived on that small plot of land for another 51 years. The cabin, once a symbol of her poverty, became a landmark. She never married, quietly declining 2 separate proposals from respectable men who were drawn to her quiet strength. She had found a sufficiency in her own judgment that she was unwilling to compromise. The knowledge her father had given her became her life's work. Later winters, though never as severe as the one of '88, were managed with an improved and expanded system. She helped her neighbors dig their own quote, 3, 1 teaching them how to line the pits with stone and seal their barrels with beeswax and tallow. The practice spread from farm to farm, a quiet revolution in self-sufficiency that made the entire region more resilient, less dependent on the fragile thread of the railway. She became known not as the strange woman who survived, but as the woman who remembered, the one who understood the deep, slow rhythms of the earth. In 1912, a young reporter from a Chicago newspaper, collecting stories of the frontier, came to redemption. He had heard a mythic tale of a woman who had fed a town from a secret hoard. He found a calm, graying woman in her late 40s, her hands gnarled from a lifetime of work, her eyes clear and direct. He expected a dramatic tale of hardship and heroism. Instead, she gave him a patient, technical explanation of thermal mass, moisture content, and the frost line. Quote, 32 she told him when he asked to publish her story under her name. Quote, 33 He wrote the article anyway, and it carried her story, and more importantly, her method, far beyond the Dakota prairie. Figures from that first winter moved through their own remaining years. The Miller children grew up, had children of their own, and every year at the first snowfall, they would bring a sack of the finest wheat from their harvest to Ruth's door, a debt they knew could never be repaid, only acknowledged. Silas Croft lived out his days as a quieter, less certain man. He ran his bank and his store, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by a cautious humility. He never spoke of that winter, but he was the first to contribute to the fund to build a new, stronger roof for the livery stable, and he extended credit freely and fairly for the rest of his life. Ruth Alden died in her sleep on a warm night in the spring of 1939, in the same cabin where she had faced down the cold 52 years before. She was 75 years old. The land passed to the Miller family, as she had specified in her will. Decades passed. The old cabin fell into disuse, the world changing around it. In the autumn of 1978, a great-grandson of Thomas Miller, a young man with plans to build a new house on the old property, began the work of tearing down the dilapidated structure. He and a friend were pulling up the warped floorboards when their crowbar struck something hard. Curious, they cleared away the debris and uncovered a set of flat, carefully laid stones. They lifted them and peered into the darkness below. There, in the cool, still air, was the pit. It was empty now, but perfectly preserved, a neat, stone-lined chamber descending into the earth. The air that rose from it was clean and dry, smelling faintly of stone, straw, and the ghost of old grain. The system was still there, a silent, wordless confirmation of a knowledge that had outlived its keeper, a final testament to the woman who had trusted the earth to remember the sun.